All right, what are we going to do tonight? We're going to look at some general comments first up, and then why do we need new translations? And then we'll look at a history and survey of English translations, and then look at which one. In the 14th century, there was one English translation of the Bible. In the 16th century, at the time of the Reformation, there were 7. 17th century 1, 18th century 2, 19th century 6, 20th century at least 47. I gave up counting after 47. And the 21st century, already in 24 years, we've got 39 or maybe more. There may be some that have slipped through that I haven't caught up with yet. Interesting, isn't it?
It is.
And awfully confusing. If you go to a bookshop and say, I want to buy a Bible.
Yes.
Awfully confusing. Christine Knight sent me a message the other day. She was at the bookshop wanting to buy one for John. And she said, help! And I said, come on Wednesday. I'm not going to do it by message, I can assure you. All right. A disclaimer first up. Every version of the Bible has some strong points and some weak points. There is no perfect translation. No version that I've ever found will remove major doctrines, but some may make them a little obscure. And the best Bible, best in inverted commas, will vary from person to person based on a variety of factors which we'll look at the end. If we get to the end. We might run out of time, that'd be a good bit, then I wouldn't have to do it. And getting into a debate about these things is a waste of time. All right? I'm glad Peter Carroll's not here, because he and I disagree on this all the time. And it's a complete waste of time, because everybody has their own preferences, and their own preferences will depend on all sorts of factors. But why is it that we need so many different translations? Well, let's begin with manuscripts. We talked last time about different manuscripts of the New Testament and of the Old Testament, but we're particularly concerned with the New. The Old Testament's fairly settled. The New Testament has all sorts of issues, and there is a science called textual criticism which works out which manuscripts are likely to be the most accurate. Now, we could spend the next 5 hours on how textual criticism works, and at the end of it you would know no more than I do, and I know nothing. It's just complex and it's difficult, and you have to be a real language expert, a manuscript expert. But let's put it as simply as possible. When you get a manuscript, copyists can miss lines. So they can be copying something out, and they can actually jump from one line down 2 lines and miss a line. And so it doesn't appear. Copyists can repeat lines, particularly when 2 lines start with the same word, you come back to repeat the line. Copyists can misspell words and change meanings. Now I think I've got, yes. The journey was fraught with difficulty, and the journey was fought with difficulty. Fought being a Scottish spelling of F-O-U-G-H-T. But if you look at that, you can see they're entirely different meanings. All right? The journey was fraught with difficulty. The journey was fought with difficulty. 2 entirely different meanings, all by changing 1 letter. Now that happens, unfortunately. Copyists can guess at a text that isn't clear. So they're looking at a manuscript and they're copying it out, and they think, oh, this is not clear, and so they guess at what it might be. Sometimes they get it wrong. A lot of times manuscripts were copied with somebody reading them, because it's expensive. And so you would have all you people sitting there, and I would read it and you would write it down. Now, often you make mistakes because you hear or your mind wanders or something like that. And copies can correct a mistake made by others. It's called scribal harmonisation. So let's have a look at that one. And I'll explain in 1 minute what textual critics would take 5 hours to explain. The NIV of Luke 6:17 says, he went down with them and stood on a level place. I think from memory the RSV says on a plain, on the plain, a level space, lower ground. Now a copyist looks at that and he says, okay, that means plain. But then he goes on to talk about the Beatitudes. And Matthew says they were given on a mount. And so another copyist says, well now, obviously that's wrong. It must be mount because that's what Matthew says. And so one copyist puts down plain or level place, the other copyist puts down mount. The first copyist belongs to a small church and they only make 10 copies. The second copyist belongs to a large church and they make 100 copies. So we can't go on the number of copies as to what's correct. So it's got nothing to do with the number of manuscripts. And we can't go on the date because the 3rd century is when the second copyist, earliest copy is found. The 4th century is when the other copyist is found. So if we said it goes on the number and the earliest, then we would assume mount is correct. Okay, the art of textual criticism is trying to work out how to solve those difficulties. And so they use all sorts of techniques to get back to what was original. Now let's assume that they think the level place or the plane is the original, using all of the different techniques. They then can put in the text a little footnote. Some manuscripts read mount, right? Which means they're not 100% sure that plain is the right reading. They think it is, and so they give an alternative. Can you see now where you have little footnotes in your Bible? It's to do with manuscripts and all sorts of other things, but manuscripts is one of them. How the scholars come to decide what is correct takes years and years of work. Westcott and Hawkey we'll talk about in a minute, who gave us the best Greek manuscript for the New Testament until recent times. I think they worked on it for 40 years to come up with their final Greek text. So it's not easy, but there are experts who can do it. All right, there are a variety of different manuscripts that we use. The Masoretic text is the text of the Old Testament, and almost everybody uses the Masoretic text for the Old Testament. We're pretty certain it's right. When you come to the Greek text, however, there's a lot of difficulties and a lot of controversies. Erasmus in 1516 was one of what people call the Enlightenment or whatever else. It was a time when scholars wanted to get back to the original. So they didn't want to read something in a copied language. They wanted to go back to the original. So if you wanted to read Homer, you went back and got a Greek version of Homer and you read his poetry in the Greek. Okay, Erasmus was one of the leading scholars who wanted to read the Bible in its original languages, Hebrew and Greek. And to do that, he produced a text which some translations still use. It's actually full of errors because he didn't have much to work on. The Textus Receptus is the basis of Luther's Bible, the basis of Tyndale's Bible, which we'll talk about, and the basis of the King James Version, and it's also the basis of some modern versions like the New King James Version, or other versions that use the King James Version. It's inadequate. As I said, no mistakes that will lead you into heresy, but it's inadequate. We've learned a lot since then. It was influenced by Erasmus, and so some of his mistakes are there. The important thing about it is it was better than the Vulgate, which we'll talk about in a minute. Why do people still use it? There's a very simple explanation. It was given to us by God, just like Shakespearean language was given to us by God. And how dare you mess with Shakespearean language or the Textus Receptus? Now, I'm sorry, but the Textus Receptus is not satisfactory anymore. In 1881, Westcott and Hort produced their text. There were new manuscripts being discovered all through the 19th century. Some very early manuscripts were discovered. And the whole idea of textual criticism really developed during the 19th century. There was also a new understanding of language. Up until the 19th century, we treated the New Testament the way we treat classical Greek, Homer and so on. And we discovered in the 19th century it's not. It's Koine Greek, it's Common Greek. We'll talk more about that in a minute as well. Discovered it by finding rubbish dumps with bits of pottery that had shopping lists and things on them. And so we learnt the language was very, very different. So Westcott and Hort made a major advance in New Testament manuscripts. Now there are a whole lot of others, but the one basically used these days is Nestle-Aland. It's the name of a number of scholars. It's the United Bible Societies have now updated that. It's being updated all the time with modern discoveries, and that's what people use these days if they really know what they're doing. But the Nestle-Aland is based on Westcott and Hort, Weiss and Tischendorf, who were continental scholars working in the same field. And then the United Bible Society texts now incorporate everything we've learnt since then. So if a version doesn't use that text, I have a few question marks about it. Again, doesn't mean it's wrong, but it's probably not as clear as it could be. There's writing. That's a page of Greek writing. You will see it's all in capitals, and there ain't no breaks between the words. Now, if you know your Greek, you can work most of that out, but you can't always work it out. Let's do it in English, because I said I was going to make it as simple as I could. There we go. If you're an atheist, that reads, God is nowhere. If you're a Christian, that reads, God is now here. Do you see the problem? And so some manuscripts can be faulty because all the words are joined together. So some mistakes come because of that. Then there's the problem of language. Classical Greek versus Koine Greek, or Common Greek. Classical Greek is the language of Athens, the great poets, the great playwrights of Athens, the great scholars of Athens. Koine Greek is the language of the ordinary people. And by New Testament times, that's the language that most people were speaking. We didn't discover that till the 19th century, and we still have problems with it. John and I both learnt Greek using Wenham, which is a classical Greek textbook written for biblical students, but it's based on all the principles of classical Greek. Basically because I think they thought it was more consistent and therefore easy to learn. I never found it easy, John, I don't know about you. But the thing is, those rules all change when you read the New Testament because it's Koine Greek. It has shorter sentences for a start, less precision and fewer word choices. Now again, I wanted to show it to you in English. So let's go to classical English, Shakespeare, and modern English. It is not in the stars to hold our destiny, but in ourselves. We decide our own destiny. You speak an infinite deal of nothing. You don't say anything. Can you see the difference? The difference between Shakespeare and the way you and I speak. Okay, that's what it's like between classical Greek and Koine Greek. You don't change the meaning necessarily, but you certainly understand it better in the language that you speak rather than the language of Shakespeare. Shakespeare, remember, was writing probably in the first 100 years of modern English. If you go back to Middle English, I still have somewhere in a box, and it can stay in a box forever as far as I'm concerned, my copy of Chaucer, which is Middle English. And interleaved in every page is my very carefully done translation of every word I didn't understand in it, because it was entirely impossible to read for me. Okay, so there's that language issue, and the earlier translations, because they understood it as classical Greek, not Koine Greek, often got things slightly wrong. There are cultural problems. I am the good shepherd. And there's the typical biblical picture of Jesus with his staff and the sheep all around him following him. Now, first of all, if you lived in Iceland, they don't look like sheep. Icelandic sheep are entirely different. If you're driving through the highlands of Scotland, Scottish sheep don't look like that. They're entirely different. And of course, modern shepherds aren't like that at all. And indeed, I am the good shepherd in Australia is hopeless as a statement about Jesus. I have a cousin, sadly he died recently, but I have a cousin who was a shepherd. Actually owned a sheep property up at Moree. He used to go off shearing most of the year. That's how he made his money. And the sheep were just left to fend for themselves. Then he'd come back, shear his own sheep, do all of the chemical stuff and everything else, and then leave them again. I know what the good shepherd to be like my cousin was, I tell you. Do you see the problem? And all through the Bible, we have the culture of the first century. All through the New Testament, we have the culture of the first century. And some of it means nothing to us. And that's why you need a commentary to explain it. And we've already dealt with money and measurements. You know, I tried to show you what it was like, and I said, these figures are all wrong because the modern basic wage is not the basic wage of Jesus' day. And so there's a whole lot of them. Like a bath is 6 gallons. I don't know what your bathtub holds. No idea. But a bath is 6 gallons. Now, of course, whole generation haven't got a clue what a gallon is now, so that doesn't help us either, does it? A becker or beaker is 1/4 of an ounce. Well, we don't know what 1/4 of an ounce is, do we? We've got millilitres and mm's, Mickey Mouse measurements, but anyway. A bushel is 1 peck. I have no idea what a peck is, and I looked up the biblical thing and couldn't find a peck in it anyway. A cab is 2 quarts. A cubit is the length from the elbow to the hand, about 8 inches. Well, that makes sense. And so it goes on. A day's journey is 20 miles. Okay, now, when they go a day's journey, they might have gone 25 miles or they might have gone 15 miles, but if you say a day's journey, you mean 20 miles, which is apparently what ancient people could do in a day. I couldn't do it, I've got to tell you. But anyway. And it's interesting, a day's journey for a horse is about 22 miles. That's about the limit of what they can do before they have to be spelled. And so it goes on. So there's a whole lot of those, and I've only printed off the first couple. But it goes on and on and on. A firkin is 9 gallons. A furlong is 1/8 of a mile. We're racing people to understand that. A mile is 4,880 feet, which is interesting because that's not what I remember. So that's the biblical mile. A mite is 1/4 cent. Remember when we had halfpennies? No, somebody say no. I do.
I remember farthings.
Yeah. Yeah, farthings, yes, sorry. I meant a farthing, not a halfpenny. Yeah, you could buy an ice block for a farthing. Yeah. I was very small at the time, I want you to know. Okay, so we always have trouble when we do it, when we convert those things. Then there's theology. Oh, sorry, I've got more. Then there's theology. Baptisia. Most versions translate it accurately as baptise. But guess what you do if you're a Baptist translator? You translate it as immerse. Because that's what they do. Now, if you believe that baptism has to be by immersion, well, there you go, that's really helpful. But you see, it's not an accurate translation. It's a bit of theology put in. And the second one I put there, and we know this is from Romans 8, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, the guy who translated the Living Bible, Kenneth Taylor, I'll talk more about him later, he wasn't a Calvinist at all. So he didn't like that, so he changed it. And we know that all that happens to us is working for our good if we love God and are fitting into his plans. The onus is on me fitting into his plans. Not being called according to his purpose. Do you see the difference? There is a very significant difference, and that is theology, not translation. And so I used to always say, don't use a translation made by one person because you'll get all of their problems. Always use a translation made by a committee, because then they will argue about it and hopefully come up with the truth. Can you see why we need so many versions? We've got all these issues. And then, of course, there's translating from one language into another language. And this is a joke you've all heard me tell before, dozens of times, but it's so good I'm going to tell it again, all right? Early days of computers. They had a big demonstration. They got a whole group of people together and they said, right, now we're going to prove that this computer can change languages. And so give us something in English. And so somebody called out of sight, out of mind. Okay, type it in or put it in the type it onto a bit of tape that goes in back in that, but anyway. All right, here we go. We're going to turn it into Russian. Press the button, lights, whiz, bang, everything else, and there's what we get. That's out of sight, out of mind in Russian. Well, we're going to make sure it's right, so let's take the Russian and put it back in. Lights flash. Let's get it out in English. Quite accurate, isn't it? But it ain't what it went in there in the first place. Now that's the problem, because you see, the languages that we're translating are different. Forget the Hebrew, just take the Greek. The Greek, English works on word order. The Greek doesn't work on word order. You can put stuff in any order you like. In fact, here we go. The Greek endings determine the parts of speech. So, the cat sat on the mat. Simple. If we, however, say cat, mat, sat on the, you don't really know what it means. You know what the original is, so you can work it out, but the mat could have been sitting on the cat. It's quite possible. Now, you put that into Greek. put in word order, and that's the top line. The bottom line, I've changed the word order around. But it makes no difference. A Greek reader would say, yeah, obviously the cat sat on the mat. Because you see, this ending is the subject, and this ending is the object. So the fact that you've got the words together doesn't matter. That's the subject, that's the object, so it's the cat sat on the mat. The cat being the subject, the mat being the object. And so the word doesn't matter. The word order doesn't matter. Because the word ending tells you what it is. That's why the first thing you do when you learn Greek is you sit there for weeks and you learn on, and you just go over and over the endings because they are so important. So that then gives you, oh sorry, I haven't put anything up for this. That then gives you the interlinear Bible. Interlinear Bibles are all the rage with some people. In the early days, I liked an interlinear Bible because I still remembered enough Greek to be able to make sense of it. Nowadays, haven't got a clue. It's Greek with a translation under it, and the translation usually comes from one particular version of the Bible. If it's literal, a literal translation, you'll sit there and shake your head and say, how on earth does that make sense? And I wanted to actually do Colossians chapter 1 verse 3 through to 12, which is one sentence in Paul. But it just got too complex. I thought, that will really upset you if I do that. So, the problem with the interlinear is you really need to be able to use it properly to actually know a little bit of Greek. The only advantage of it is if you want to chase up a word. And then you can look at the word, look at the Greek, and actually chase up the Greek word. This is probably a good time to mention it. In the days before computers, one of the most valuable books I had was Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, if you wanted to carry it around, it was huge. Every word of the Bible was there. Greek and English and a whole lot of information about it. Now the beauty of it was that you could look at a word and you could see all the different ways it was translated in the authorised version. And reverse, you could look at an English word and see what the Greek word was, and then you could look up that Greek word in a lexicon and understand all that sort of thing. It took a lot of time. Computers are wonderful now. I press a button and it all comes up. It's fantastic. But that's one of the reasons that the authorised version was so important, because you had to actually remember what you were looking for. And the modern versions don't have the same sort of language, and so you couldn't find the words or the passage or whatever else. So what happens is that the interlinear Bible is not as helpful as some people think it is. Now, language. I have a desk calendar that I bought this year called Vanishing Vocabulary. That is, there are 365 days of words that no longer are used. There's some fascinating ones. Words disappear. When we went and picked up my wife's car, I looked at the number plate and I said to her, that's a word. She being a mathematician, yeah. But F-E-Y-O-8-N is a number plate. So I thought, Faye, that's a word. It's definitely a word. She said, what is it? What's it mean? And I said, oh, I don't know. I think it means something like vague. And you'll be surprised to hear when I got home, I was pretty close to being right. It actually literally means having a notion about death or a calamity that's about to befall you. But then it gradually changes, and it now means giving an impression of vague unworldliness. Oh, I like good. But I remember using that word. don't use it anymore. And then there are words in the, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because a lot of people still think the authorised version is best, and so I need to explain, not only is there a text problem, but there are major word problems. But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet. I ain't going to pray in the wardrobe, sorry. Means bedroom. In King James's day. O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you? Isn't that what they did on Bewitched? It means led you astray. And after those days we took up our carriages and went up to Judea. I can just imagine Paul and Luke with this carriage, you know, humping it around with the wheels dangling out. It means luggage. Would you have known that?
No.
You read the authorised version, you got very weird ideas of what Paul and Luke did then. He answered and said, it is not meet to take the children's bread. Well, that means fit and proper. Now that's a word that we probably have heard. You have respect for him that weareth the gay clothing. What's that, rainbow coloured clothing? Nah, doesn't mean that at all, of course. And then talking about the bishop, he must be without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent. I love that. I love the bishop being incontinent. It means unrestrained. And you can see how it's developed over time. But it means unrestrained. He must not be any of those things, actually. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering. Now, the meaning's quite obvious. It means lewdness, immorality, which is what you do in the chamber, isn't it? But it ain't a word we use these days. God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. You know what that means, don't you? Restock the store. Nah. It means fill it up from scratch. It's not restocking at all. Entirely different meaning. And they were instant with loud voices. It means insistent. And they came into the coasts of Caesarea Philippi. I had a look on a map. There ain't no water anywhere near Caesarea Philippi. Coasts mean borders. So they came to the borders of Caesarea Philippi. Thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing. The Lord will abhor the bloody and deceitful man. Now, that's a psalm, so the second part is a sort of restatement of the first. So leasing means deceitful. But you didn't know that, did you? No. Okay, so do you see the problem? The King James Version, and there are dozens of others, is full of words that if you are not familiar with the King James Version, you won't understand. People who grew up with it learn what they meant, looked them up and learned what they meant, and so they can still read it without a great deal of difficulty. And there may be new words that are more appropriate. Modern culture changes things, and the biggest issue is inclusive language. Had a lot of arguments about this. Should we have inclusive language? Should we let the world impose upon us its standards? If the original text uses male-dominated language, then can't we use that? So, for every kind of beasts and of birds of the servants, etc., the earth has been tamed of mankind. We've been using mankind ever since there was an English language, and we all know what it means, and I don't think it puts down women at all. But of course we've now got to change it. For every species of beast and bird, reptile, sea creature can be tamed and has been tamed by the human species, which is the NRSV. It's a fight we'll never win. We're stuck with it. We're going that way. What we have to be careful of course, is that we don't start letting other cultural things come in and change the scriptures. I don't think anything rests on this, so I don't really care. Indeed, I find myself changing older versions. The NIV says, have been tamed by man. And I find myself changing sometimes those words to gender-inclusive words. Modern literacy. Reader's Digest is the best-selling magazine in the world. It's aimed at people who read at the level of a 14 and 15-year-old child. That's why it's so popular. That's why they have that section. Remember, it pays to increase your word power, because they like their readers to get a bit more educated. Trouble is, of course, there's an unwillingness to learn. The Good News Bible has a similar aim. It's aimed at the 14 to 15-year age level. And when we come to look at the Good News Bible, I'll tell you the problems with that. The Oxford Dictionary says that there are 171,476 words. It's 47,000 obsolete words, but stick with the 171,500, we'll say, still in use. The university graduate is estimated to use 23,000. An educated adult is estimated to use 15,000. A student who's reached HSC level is estimated to use 12,000. And the number is declining. So when you are translating a Bible, you have to be a little bit careful, because there are a lot of words that are familiar with the translators who are word experts that the ordinary person hasn't got a clue about. That's why the Simple English Bible, which I've never used, uses 3,000 words in total, from Genesis to Revelation. All right, the issues. When you come to translate, you have a number of choices. You can be literal, which is where you take the passage in the Greek or the Hebrew and you translate it exactly as it's written there, which makes no sense whatsoever in English. So a literal translation is never genuinely literal. What it does, however, it sticks as close as possible to what is there. You can then have what's called dynamic equivalence, which is what most Bibles are. Dynamic equivalence is where you look at it and you say, right, it says this, how can we put that in English so that it reads all right? So you change things around. You might add a preposition that isn't there, all sorts of things like that. But it's where you actually make it so it can be read in English. And then there's a paraphrase where you take the thing and you say, now what does that say? And you put it in English free-flowing, got nothing to do with the original other than that's the meaning that we're going to say the same thing. We'll have a look at that in a little while. And there is still the issue of vocabulary. Now, the translator has to look at all those things when deciding what to do with the manuscript that he's already had to have a fight about. You need to know those things because I'm going to mention them. I'm going to keep going on to a history of the English Bible because otherwise we'll still be here at midnight. Now, I'm not going to start with an English Bible, I'm going to start with the Vulgate, which was produced by Jerome in 366 to 384. Denis, the Bishop of Rome, during that time, he asked his secretary, Jerome, to produce a Latin version of the Bible because there were dozens and dozens of different Latin versions of the Bible. And they were very different. And so he wanted one that would be a standard version. He didn't want to do the job, Jerome, because he knew it was going to be really unpopular. All Bible translations unpopular, let me tell you. He knew it was going to be really unpopular, but he was hoping that he would succeed Denis as Bishop of Rome. He didn't. Jerome was very intelligent with what he did. He actually used a large number of Latin texts. So he looked at all that was around, and then he went back to the Greek manuscripts. And so he compared the Latin text that he had with the Greek manuscripts and the Hebrew, although there's not as much about that in the story. So he came up with what was a pretty good Latin translation, which was used immediately by Augustine and Pelagius, but the church didn't fully accept it till the 9th century. So you still had a whole lot of other versions hanging around. And then in the 9th century they said that's the Bible, and the Roman Catholic Church right through until the middle of the 20th century would not have a Bible that was not based on the Vulgate. And when the RSV came out, they were willing to accept that, and then all Catholic Bibles after that have actually used modern manuscripts. It was copied many times. The texts were full of errors or continual attempts to get back to the original, but it remains a very important Bible. But it's in Latin, and English people don't speak Latin. Well, the Reformers discovered even the priests didn't speak Latin. They learned it off by heart and did it in the service. They didn't have a clue what it was read. So then you have John Wycliffe, 1330 to 1384. Wycliffe was called the morning star of the Reformation because he had ideas that were later taken up by the Reformers. So well ahead of his time. 2 centuries ahead of his time. He wrote in 1378, "The Bible is the sole source of doctrine. Therefore, the Pope has no authority." Made him popular, as you'll understand. He may not have done the translation himself, we don't know. He certainly was responsible for it, but how much of it he did or whether he did any, we don't know. But in 1415, the Catholic Church condemned his Bible and had all copies burned, all the copies they could find. Wycliffe was put to death, and in 1428, the Pope had his body exhumed, burnt, and the ashes cast into the river. You shouldn't translate the Bible, it's a dangerous task. 180 copies of Wycliffe's Bible have survived. The translation was done from the Vulgate, so from the Latin into English, not from original manuscripts, from the Latin into English. Now between Wycliffe and the next translation, there was a revolution. The revolution involved Johannes Gutenberg in 1440. He's the guy at the top who invented movable type. Down the bottom, in the Santa hat, is William Caxton, who set up a printing press in Westminster in London, that's near Buckingham Palace, in 1476. And suddenly it was possible to print the Bible in numerous editions, over and over and over and over. Now, printing was not an easy task. I don't know if you've ever been to an old printing factory. When I was at school, I remember they used to take us out on careers days, and we went to a printing place, and all the letters were there in boxes, and to set it up you had to pick a letter and put it in the thing, and to get another letter and put it in the thing, and at the end of it you had to put the letters back and hope they didn't go in the wrong spot. It was a horrendous task, and that's how it was done. And so the most important person was the proofreader who looked at it to see if he got it right, if the printer got it right. When I was a kid, the guy across the road was a proofreader for the Newcastle Morning Herald. He used to get home about 4 in the morning. His job was to sit there and read the Herald, every line, and come up with all the mistakes so they could change them. And do you remember stop press? That was you made a stamp and you stamped it with ink on the back of the paper because you couldn't change the print because it was too much work. Nowadays, of course, it's all done by computer and it's easy. But once it's set up and it does a good job. There were mistakes that proofreaders didn't correct. For example, there's one version of the Bible that has Psalm 119 verse 161 where it reads, "Rulers have persecuted me." The Bible says, "Printers have persecuted me." So there was somebody who wasn't happy with his boss. And of course there was the wicked Bible which left out the "not" in "thou shalt commit adultery." But that made a big difference to the English Bible. So Martin Luther in 1517 began the Reformation. He nailed his 95 Theses to that door, the door, probably more modern now, but that's the door of Wittenberg Castle, the Wittenberg Church. And that begins the Reformation. And there is a new interest in the laity, the priesthood of all believers. And therefore, the laity need to be able to read the Bible. And so Luther translates the Bible. And Luther's translation of the Bible has a huge influence on William Tyndale, who we'll talk about next, and indeed on all future editions of the English Bible, as we'll see. William Tyndale, 1492 to 1536. And you see in the picture on the right, William Tyndale being burned at the stake because he didn't want to be a Bible translator. It was not a good life. He couldn't get insurance, that's for sure. Tyndale in 1523 sought permission from the Bishop of London to translate the Bible into English. It was refused, so he left for the continent and he never returned. But copies of his translations kept coming back to England. In May 4th, 1530, copies were burned at St Paul's Cross in London. Not only didn't they want the congregation, the people, the church to have the Bible in English, but they didn't like some of his translation. For example, ecclesia, he translated congregation. Now those who were here last year when I did the doctrine lectures on the church, you will realise that's the Knox Robinson doctrine of the church. It's the local congregation that matters. And the Catholics were not happy with that. He translated it as congregation. Episcopos, he translated as overseer, not bishop, overseer, which we've talked about. Presbyteros, elder, not priest. Love for charity. And penance, do penance, we changed to repent. So he's burnt at the stake for that. Let me quickly do the next few before we get on to the modern stuff. 1536, Miles Coverdale. 1537, Matthew's Bible. Miles Coverdale's Bible used the Greek text of Erasmus, the Vulgate, Luther's German Bible, and Tyndale as his basis. And that's the first complete Bible printed in English. Matthew's Bible was the work of John Rogers. John Rogers was an associate of Tyndale. John Rogers was burnt during Bloody Mary's reign. Now Matthew's Bible was made up of Tyndale's Pentateuch and the New Testament, and then he pinched other translations that Tyndale hadn't finished from Joshua to 2 Chronicles and Ezra to Malachi and the Apocrypha. 1539, the Great Bible. The Great Bible used the Masoretic text, the Greek New Testament of Erasmus, the Vulgate, and Luther's Bible, but really it's a revision of Tyndale. It's a revision of Matthew's Bible carried out by Coverdale. It's called the Great Bible because Henry VIII had it placed in every church in England. It had to be chained to the lectern because people kept pinching it, because it was so exciting to have a Bible in English. And it's the Great Bible that is still in the old Prayer Book of 1662, and the bits of that remain in the modern Prayer Book are the Great Bible. That's what was used. Cambridge was a patron of it in its later years. The Taverner's Bible was a minor revision of Matthew's Bible that was more accurate. The Geneva Bible was published in Geneva, though it had a dedication to Elizabeth. It was reformed and it had a very accurate translation. And for many years after the authorised version, it was still being used. It's the Bible of Shakespeare, for example. All right, the authorised version came out in Shakespeare's day, but Shakespeare would have still used this. The problem is it's Calvinistic and anti-bishops. So guess what was produced next? The Bishop's Bible. Yes, there we go. It removes the controversies of the Geneva Bible. And then finally the Douay-Rheims Bible, which is a Catholic Bible, the Latin Vulgate, but it actually used Greek and Hebrew manuscripts and was the Roman Catholic response to the Reformation. Let's stop there and we'll start with the authorised version, the King James Version. After I've had a rest and you've had a cup. English of any Bible. I mean, it really is good language. And it's got more words, different words than any, it's a pity it's got some problems. The picture there is of King James, and the picture on the right is of a drawing of the Hampton Court Conference. When James came to the throne, and James I of England was James VI of Scotland, it's fascinating. Elizabeth spent all of her time trying to get rid of Mary, Queen of Scots, because Mary, Queen of Scots posed a threat to her because she was an alternative queen. And when Elizabeth died, Mary, Queen of Scots' son became King of England. I mean, it's crazy, isn't it? Anyway, James VI of Scotland, James I of England. Because he was Scottish, the Puritans thought this is a chance for us to get our own way. The Puritans always had problems with the Anglican Church. This was a chance to get our own way. We now got a Puritan, a Scotsman. But James was not a Puritan. In fact, in many ways, he's more Catholic than even the Anglicans. The Hampton Court Conference was where the Puritans came and put all of their requests to him, and they got very few of them accepted, except the desire for a new version of the Bible. The bishops opposed it, but James said, let's do it. The result, and he took an interest in it. He actually was involved in not the actual translation, but in making sure it occurred in a particular way. And what's written, let me start again. It was really, it's really important if you ever get the chance to read the preface to the authorised version. It's one of the best statements of how to translate a Bible you'll find. It's not usually printed anymore. You need to find an old copy, but it's brilliant. But here's what James wrote. The rules. The bishop's Bible was to be altered as little as the truth of the original will permit. In other words, you go back to the good text and you change whatever needs to be changed, but don't change anything that you don't have to. Because the bishop's Bible suits England. It hasn't got all this Calvinistic stuff. And certain other translations should be used where they agreed better with the text, namely Tyndale, Matthew's, Coverdale's, Whitchurch's, which is the Great Bible because the printer was Whitchurch, and Geneva. And the old ecclesiastical words were to be kept. The word church is not to be translated congregation, And no marginal notes. The Geneva Bible had all these theological marginal notes. No marginal notes were to be used except for necessary explanation of Hebrew or Greek words. Brilliant! Because what the translators produced was a Bible that everybody, every Protestant could accept. It didn't matter whether you were high church or low church, Puritan, whether you were a free church, it was acceptable to everybody. And that's why it lasted 400 years. He did actually say you can't translate these passages the way that the Great Bible does, or the Bishop's Bible does. Exodus 1:19, 2 Kings 9:33, 2 Chronicles 15:16. Exodus 1:19 suggests that you can disobey Pharaoh. James believed in the divine right of kings. God couldn't possibly say that you could disobey a king, could he? And 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles talk about Jezebel, you know, that she's ordered to be cast down, and you can't kill a queen. Particularly remembering, of course, Mary, Queen of Scots, who was killed, his mother. So he did take an interest, but it was a brilliant bit of work. All of the leading academics of the day were involved. Lancelot Andrews was involved. He's the guy on the left. I don't know who the guy on the right is, actually. Oh, yes, I do. Yeah. On the left, Lancelot Andrews. Lancelot Andrews began to learn Greek at the age of 6. Not bad. John Boyce and Andrew Downes began to learn Hebrew at the age of 5. And it was said of Lancelot Andrews, the guy on the left, that he eventually knew so many languages that he had he been at the Tower of Babel, he could have translated for everybody. All right. Okay, so it's a brilliant work. There is no doubt. There is no Bible has ever come close to it, for sure. In 1701, the printing of 1701 added the dates that were set by the guy on the right, Bishop Usher, who was Bishop of all Ireland. He was an Irishman, that makes sense, doesn't it? Usher's dates, that's the book he wrote, The Annals of the World. Usher's dates are very clear. The world was created in 4004 BC. Right? Makes sense, doesn't it? He simply went back through all the genealogies and took all the years, and he worked out that 4004 BC was the year of creation. And then he worked all the others out. Now, we laugh at that, but I haven't got it in my notes, and I don't know why I haven't got it in my notes. Sir Isaac Newton, the great physicist, believed the world was created in 4004 BC. Usher wasn't out there on his own. There were a lot of leading scholars who actually accepted that. But when you get a King James Bible, an authorised version Bible, I'll explain. Authorised version is the English word, King James version is the American word. Because it was never authorised in America, it's King James version. If you get an old Bible, and I used to have one anyway, with the dates in the margin, just ignore them. Because they really are hopeless. Noah Webster's Bible, very important. Noah Webster, of course, prepared an American dictionary. When I was very small, my parents, they probably spent 2 or 3 weeks' wages on it, bought me a Webster's dictionary, which I still have. It's about that thick. I can't read it anymore because a book that thick, the binding doesn't last, and it's falling to pieces. But it's what gave me my love of words. I used to sit and read it. Of course, they were uneducated. They didn't understand that when I got to school, everybody said, no, you've got to have an Oxford dictionary or a Cambridge dictionary. But never mind. So Noah Webster produced Webster's dictionary, and if you ever look at Wikipedia or any of those things to get a definition, you get the Merriam-Webster dictionary. The Webster family sold the rights to the Merriam Publishing Company, and the modern Webster's dictionaries are therefore called the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Anyway, that's irrelevant. They sold really well. 300,000 annually, not bad for a dictionary. And then he said, hang on, what about the Bible? In the century since 1611, changes have taken place in words. Some are obscure, some have fallen into disuse, some have changed their usage. And so it's not good for the Word of God to be unintelligible. So a version of the Scriptures, and I'm quoting from Noah Webster, for popular use should consist of words expressing the sense which is most common in popular usage, so that the first idea suggested to the reader should be the true meaning of such words according to the original languages. He found 150 words to be erroneous or misleading. Things like be not anxious he used for take no thought. He used food for meat, falsehood for leasing, boiled for sodden, hinder, as in the obsolete sense of let, prevent. He changed the Holy Ghost to the Holy Spirit. Where the Authorised Version reads, God forbid, he changed it to be it not so. The interesting thing is that the Revised Version, which I'll talk about in a minute, incorporated every change that Noah Webster made without giving him any credit for it. Apparently there was a facsimile version produced recently, but it's not a Bible you'll ever get to read, but it's very important because it affected the Revised Version, which affected the Revised Standard Version, and so on. The Revised Version of 1885. The Revised Version was based on the new text that was produced by Westcott and Hort, far superior to the Textus Receptus. It was meant to be a revision of the Authorised Version using Westcott and Hort, and only revising passages that needed amending. Again, the preface to it is well worth reading. The Old Testament is much closer to the Authorised Version than the New Testament. The New Testament is criticised because of the English language. All modern translations now have literary experts working with them, but the Revised Version didn't. The King James Version was to be the starting point, and the revisers were instructed to use as few alterations as possible. And it's the most accurate Bible that you can get. Very hard to read because it's so literal. John went to college after Brook Knox's day. When I was in college, this is the only Bible we were allowed to use because it was accurate. C.H. Spurgeon said of it, it's strong in Greek, but weak in English. In other words, it wasn't easy to read. Now, when it was produced by two groups of scholars, one English and one American. But it was produced in England. And the American scholars kept making suggestions and the English scholars kept refusing to incorporate them. So in 1901, the American translation committees produced the American Standard Version, which is exactly the same as the Revised Standard Version, but incorporates the differences that the Americans wanted to incorporate. Okay, so those are two very, very accurate Bibles, but hard to read. The first Bible that sort of moved away from the literal thing was James Moffat's translation of the New Testament first, and then later a translation of the whole Bible. His Greek text, unfortunately, was the Greek text of Herman von Soden. It was later seen to contain all sorts of errors, which is a great pity. The New Testament is better than the Old because he was a better Greek scholar than a Hebrew scholar. It's called the Scots Bible because he actually uses some words that are Scots words, not English words, like the word for servant in the parable of the son. The word he uses is not servant, but factor, which is a Scotch word for servant. I still use it. And the reason I still use it is they produced a series of commentaries on the Moffat New Testament, written, I think there's one or two by Moffat, but written by the great scholars of the day, of the 1920s. And I still find those commentaries helpful. And those commentaries, of course, print the Moffat text, so I always look at it when I look at those commentaries. F.F. Bruce said Moffat is still the best way to get a true meaning of a whole epistle. Now, there have been Bibles produced since then, so, but anyway. Some very good commentaries associated with it that, as I say, I still use. J.B. Phillips produced in 1947 Letters to Young Churches, then the Gospels and Revelation, and then in 1958 the New Testament in Modern English. He was working amongst youth in London during the Blitz, and he wanted a Bible that they could understand. And so he decided to translate it himself. He was quite a scholar. F.F. Bruce writes this: of all modern, and remember he wrote this in the 70s before a lot of modern stuff, of all modern English translations of the New Testament epistles, this is one of the best, perhaps actually the best for the ordinary reader. And so he goes on. Phillips is brilliant in some of his expressions. I mean, when Paul says at the end of an epistle, greet one another with a holy kiss. Ugh. What does J.B. Phillips say? Greet one another with a hearty handshake. And where the other Bibles say, do not be conformed to this world, J.B. Phillips says, do not let this world squeeze you into its mould. Brilliant. And I must admit, I still love J.B. Phillips, and I still look at him quite regularly. But the big Bible of the 20th century was the Revised Standard Version. The Old Testament came out in 1946, the New Testament in 1952. So when I was converted, it was still new. It was based on the idea that the American Standard Version was too literal, that there was a need for a thorough revision, but it was to stay as close to the King James Version as possible, that it was to use the latest textual information, so Westcott and Hort and so on, and it was to have current English usage. Now, when they first wanted to do it, it was the Depression, and they couldn't get money to get it started. When they finally got it started, it was World War II, and so the English scholars couldn't be involved. They had a small part to play in the Old Testament. That's why the New English Bible was translated, because this was an American Bible. The RSV was an American Bible. There was an edition which removed the Americanisms, and in 1971 there were some changes made because of the new United Bible Society's text. What happened to the Revised Standard Version? Remember I said it's not a good idea to become a Bible translator? A number of the panel were accused by Joe McCarthy of being communists. It was later repudiated in congressional hearings, but a lot of them had their reputations destroyed. It was also said to be modernist theology. It's based on a few versions, and I think it's an unreasonable criticism, but that was it. It was a brilliant translation. You know, the sad thing is, 4652, it's now languages hopelessly out of date. There's no way moderns will feel familiar with it, which is a great pity because it did stick close to the authorised version. Then there's the Berkeley version, which is a modern language version of the authorised version, the American one. The Amplified Bible. It's a revision of the American Standard Version. But what they've done is they've given you a choice as a reader of what you want of what the word means. So you can make it mean whatever you think suits you. And so I put there the first of the Beatitudes, and notice they each begin with blessed. But note the first one you can have blessed, or you can have spiritually prosperous, happy to be admired. Second one you have forgiven, refreshed by God's grace. Third one inwardly peaceful, spiritually secure, worthy of respect. Fourth one joyful, nourished by God's goodness. Yeah, just stick with blessed. Surely. And then are the poor in spirit, those devoid of spiritual arrogance, those who regard themselves as insignificant. Well, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, both now and forever. And blessed are those who mourn over their sins and repent, for they will be comforted when the burden of sin is lifted. And so on, you get the idea. Do not use the Amplified Bible. It really is useless because it will let you decide what you want to believe. And yeah. All right, and then a whole lot of them. The Jerusalem Bible in 1966. It was actually a translation from a French Bible, but using Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek texts. It's the first Roman Catholic version not based on the Vulgate, and it was, some bits of it were paraphrased, but a lot of scholars liked it. Don Robinson, who was the New Testament scholar at Moore College and the vice principal, who was very influential. We got a copy of the Jerusalem Bible when we were ordained. You presented with the Bible when you were ordained, and we got a copy of the Jerusalem Bible, which I've never used since, I have to say, but it's not bad. Then there's the New English Bible of 1970, came about because England wasn't involved in the RSV. Based on good texts, it began when the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland asked for a new version and got their way. It involved all the Protestant denominations in the United Kingdom. C.H. Dodd, probably the greatest New Testament scholar of the 20th century, was the General Director. But it was unpopular because it was so different. It was a complete move away from the authorised version, and people couldn't cope with that. It tends to be very literary. It's an English Bible that's the literary people have had a lot to say on it. It's actually a very good Bible. It's never appealed to me. I've never been able to get comfortable with it. But it is actually a good Bible. Then there's the Living Bible, 1971, the work of Kenneth Taylor. Kenneth Taylor wanted his children to understand the Bible. And there were 10 of them. So he got to work. He used to actually do the translation on the train on the way to work. He was a Baptist, but we'll forgive him for that. Just checking my wife's awake. I've already given you a little bit of theology, and there are some things in it for which there is absolutely no warrant in the text at all. It's probably the most popular modern Bible in America up until the New International Version. Billy Graham used to give it away at crusades. You know, if you came forward, you got a Living Bible. If you listened to the Hour of Decision on radio and you wrote in, they sent you a copy of the Living Bible or part of the Living Bible. It was very, very popular. But a paraphrase, not reliable. The New American Standard Bible is more readable than the American Standard Version. The Good News Bible, produced in 1976, began as today's English version. Indeed, the New Testament came out as Good News for Modern Man with all those little cartoon drawings through it. The Good News Bible uses the best possible text, but its problem is it's got the Reader's Digest literary level, and that can be difficult. So, for example, I preached once, I was visiting somewhere and I was preaching on 2 Corinthians 5:17 following, and I discovered they had the Good News Bible in the pews. My entire sermon was ruined. Because you see, Paul says, Paul was talking about reconciliation. God was reconciling. Now, reconciliation isn't a term in the vocabulary of a 14-year-old. So what does the Good News Bible say? God was making all human beings his friends. It tells how he makes them his friends. Let God change you from enemies into his friends. Now, I'm sorry, but making friends is not the same as reconciliation. Right? My whole sermon was based on reconciliation, and I had nothing to go on. It's really embarrassing. But that's the problem. When you want to make something simple for young readers, you can't use terms that are actually technical terms. And what you should do is you should use them and put a footnote explaining what they are. Because making friends is not adequate for reconciliation. It's a very small part of the meaning of reconciliation. The Good News Bible was based on requests from missionaries to the American Bible Society for a Bible for people who were new in speaking English. And so it has a really good reason for existence. Now, apart from that, if you don't want to use it for a study Bible, it's a very good Bible. But that's its limitation. And then you have the New International Version of 1978, which was then revised in 84 and 2011. 1996, they produced the Inclusive Language Version. 1998, the Reader's Version, which was simplified for children, and then the children's version as well. Began in the 1950s as an evangelical response to the RSV being too liberal. So all of the committees were evangelical. It began in 1968. It is truly international. Well, for the Americans anyway. There were 87 Americans, 3 Canadians, 2 Australians, and 2 New Zealanders. And I haven't written the number from England, there are 4 or 5 from England. And that makes it international. Our 2 were Leon Morris and David Williams, both from Ridley College in Melbourne. All of the translators were committed to the authority and infallibility of the word of the Bible as God's word in written form. There are inconsistencies. In the Gospels we have the 3rd hour and the 6th hour. In Acts we have in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. Some words were added, some words were omitted. It's a little more colloquial than the RSV, a little less free than the New English Bible. And revisions have been produced because of new manuscript discoveries and words. It's the most popular Bible in the USA and the most popular Bible amongst evangelicals worldwide, which is why we use it here. It costs $8 million to produce. Now, the New International Version gets used because it's the Church Bible. So when I'm preparing a sermon, I prepare it with the New International Version text in front of me. I prefer the New Revised Standard Version, which I always look at. But the New International Version is what you have to base it on because it's what everybody's using. My experience with the New International Version was when Walter Kaiser was delivering the Moore College lectures one year, and he was delivering them on Proverbs, and he was the chairman of the translation panel for wisdom literature. And all through his lectures, he kept putting up the NIV and saying, yeah, but this would be a better translation. And I thought, hang on a minute, this was the guy that was the chairman anyway. He was a lovely guy. He came to visit me in my study at Moore College, and we talked for a while. And I thought I'd do him a real favour. I said, would you like to come for a walk? We'll go to the Maclean Museum at Sydney University, just across the campus. Oh yeah, I'd love that, he said. So off we went. Well, we got there, and I just stood for 2 hours learning about the exhibits. Oh look, they've got the development of the oil lamp from stuff. This is how they, and they did that to improve. I learned so much. I don't know what he got out of it, but I got a huge amount out of it. But anyway, that's beside the point. The New King James Version is a revision of the Authorised Version. It's an American revision. It uses the Textus Receptus, and that, I think, is one of its problems. It's also not as easy to read as the Authorised Version, to tell you the truth. I've never liked it, I have to say, but that's me. The Revised English Bible is a revision of the New English Bible, slightly more conservative and more colloquial. Ecclesia, outside of Jerusalem, is translated, in the NEB, the New English Bible, Ecclesia outside of Jerusalem is translated congregation in Jerusalem, it's translated church, but in the Revised one it's inconsistent, it's all over the place. I guess because I never got really in with the New English Bible, I've never used the Revised Version. The New RSV, the New Revised Standard Version, it's a revision of the RSV based on all of the new manuscript discoveries made, particularly with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Changes were made only where it was necessary in paragraph structures and punctuation, in the elimination of archaisms, but it was to retain the flavour of Tyndale and the King James Version, create accuracy and clarity, and of course it eliminates masculine-oriented language. There was a version in 1995 produced in England to remove all the Americanisms. Cambridge University decided to use this as a version for all of their divinity studies, and then most of the other British universities followed suit. It's my favourite, simply because I grew up on the Authorised Version and the Revised Standard Version, and this is close enough to those two. And it's more accurate than the RSV and more modern, so I stick with it, but that's me. We'll get to the controversial bit in a minute. The New Century Version, simple words, good text. It deserves to be better known. Not many people use it, but it does deserve to be better known. The Contemporary English Version is based on the original text. It's not a revision of any previous version. It's a lower literary level than even the Good News Bible. So it's designed for upper primary school children, I guess. So it uses story for parable and hooray for Hosanna and things like that. And the New Living Translation, it went back with a committee, not just one person, went back to the original text, and it used dynamic equivalence, not paraphrase. The committee was made up of 90 evangelical scholars. The language is at the level of a junior high student, so it's a big improvement on the Living Bible. The English Standard Version of 2001 is a revision of the RSV. It's American. It's essentially literal. It's produced by a Reformed evangelical panel, and it's been revised in 2007, 2011, 2016. If I wasn't going to use the New Revised Standard Version, that's the version I'd use. It's actually very good. And then there's the Message. Eugene Peterson, total paraphrase. Galatians 5:19-21. It's obvious what kind of life develops out of trying to get your own way all the time. Repetitive, loveless, cheap sex. A stinking of mental and emotional garbage. Frenzied and joyless grabs for happiness. Trinket gods. Magic show religion. Paranoid loneliness. Cutthroat competition. All-consuming yet never satisfied wants. A brutal temper. An impotence to love or be loved. Divided homes and divided lives. Small-minded and lopsided pursuits. The vicious habit of depersonalising everyone into a rival. Uncontrolled and uncontrollable addictions, ugly parodies of community. I could go on. They're the sins of the flesh. It's very good, but of course it's got nothing to do with the original. And I have printed for you, I think, Matthew 5, because it's a passage you know well. The world is full of so-called prayer warriors who are prayer ignorant and full of formulas and programs and advice, peddling techniques for getting what you want from God. Don't fall for that nonsense. This is your Father you are dealing with, and He knows better than you what you need. There's a God like this loving you, you can pray very simply like this. And then we have the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, reveal who you are, set the world right, do what's best as above as below, keep us alive with 3 square meals. Keep us forgiven with you and forgiving others. Keep us safe from ourselves and the devil. You're in charge. You can do anything you want. You're a blazing beauty. Yes, yes, yes. Okay. I put those there because I like a good laugh. What he's trying to do, of course, is to put in language that a teenager would use. And, fair enough, but it ain't a Bible, and certainly not for study. Today's New International Version, it's a revision of the NIV, the Common English Bible is a new translation, simple, reads well. Lexham English Bible is produced by Logos Bible Software, the mob that provide all of the Bible stuff that I use. And the Modern English Version, which is a revision of the Authorised Version. It's most modern, but it's not the best text. I've left myself a few minutes to do what's the best version. I've given you a sheet from Bible Gateway. Bible Gateway is free, and you can look up a passage in all of these versions on Bible Gateway, which is pretty impressive. Now, when you now know a little bit about the versions, or some of them I haven't even mentioned, because there are a lot. I didn't have time to go through everything. When I'm preparing a sermon, I start with the New Revised Standard Version, because that's the Bible I use. But then, of course, I print off the text for the New International Version, because that's the Bible the church uses. Then I work out what the passage means, and then I go back and look at Phillips, Moffat, all of those, to see if there's a better way of expressing it. Now I know what it means, so I'm not going to be fooled by somebody putting something wrong in. But sometimes one version is a little bit clearer, a little bit easier to understand than another. And so I regularly use at least half a dozen different Bibles in sermon preparation. I recommend that. The beauty of this, you can also print the passage, which is very helpful if you're travelling somewhere. You don't have to carry your Bible with you. You print off the passages for the week and there you've got it. All right, how do you decide what Bible to use? Well, I want it to be as close to the original as possible. So a literal Bible is good. But then a dynamic equivalent Bible is easier to read, so I'd like that. I'm not happy with the paraphrase, that doesn't turn me on at all. But it does depend, and I want it to use the best text, so I'm not going to go back too far because I want the modern text. And I want it to use modern language, which is why I leave the authorised version out. Love the authorised version, but the language is not the language of today, so that's not the Bible I'm going to use. Now, I look at those and I decide, according to my purpose, what I want to do. If I want to study the Bible, then I want to go back as close to the literal as I can get to see exactly what it says. If I want to read the Bible in public, then I'm going to go to a dynamic equivalent because the literal is not going to be good reading. If I want an overview of a book, I may well go to a paraphrase, a good one, so that I can sit in one setting. And we're going to spend 6 weeks on Romans. Well, you really ought to start by reading Romans from start to end in one go. You really should. And use a paraphrase. And then you need to check your own literary level. If your literary level is low, then you need to use something simpler. They're the things I would take into account. All right, so because I have the theological education that I've got, for a study Bible, I want something that's close to literal. When I'm reading in the public, I want something I can read that actually sounds good. And if I'm going to start a study on the letter to James, for example, I'm going to find the paraphrase and read it right through. So here are my choices. Now remember, and won't be, I've left out there, I should have put it in. It has to be what you're familiar with. I keep sticking to revisions of the authorised version because that's what I'm familiar with. And so I don't find the New English Bible helpful. But people who grew up without the authorised version as what they were learning will find it really good. So, you know, it's what you're used to. And because I grew up with the authorised version and the RSV, I want to stick to that pattern. But here's what I would do. For a literal Bible, I would choose the NRSV or the ESV. Right? The New Revised Standard Version of the English Standard Version. They are modern, they are good translations, they are close enough to literal. They're not really, but they're better than anything else. If I want to read something publicly, I'm going to choose the New International Version because it reads better than the ESV or the New RSV. I'll still use the RSV, but I'll put it in yellow because it's not up there on the list. If I want to read a whole section right through, I would use the Good News Bible. Or J.B. Phillips, simply because I'm familiar with J.B. Phillips and I love him, but the Good News Bible is more accurate. When I read the Bible to my children, it was always the Good News Bible that I read. And so that's the one I would sit down to read the passage. More than 100 Bibles I've left out. You may find one of the 100 or so that I've left out to be better than those. And if you do, that's fine. Because it's everybody's personal preference. It's what gets you closest to God that matters. But if you want to know, that's what I read. Okay? Still with me?
Yep.
Let's finish in prayer. Father, it can be confusing when we go into a bookshop and see dozens and dozens of different Bibles. Father, hopefully tonight we've actually looked at the issues, and hopefully when we come to choose a Bible to read, we'll base it on these principles. But most of all, Father, help us to read your word in whatever form and speak to us through it, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.